Geoff, why don't you start first and tell us a bit, not that the film didn't do a good job of this, but tell us a bit about where Milgram fits in human subjects research and what's his legacy like right now in psychological studies.
I mean, I would say the Milgram experiment is the most famous and influential experiment in all of social psychology. So the 1960s and 1970s were a very rich time for experimentation, and there was a lot more ethical freedom at that time to do experiments like the one Milgram ran. But I think most social psychologists would sort of see his experiment as kind of the crown jewel in this, in the social psych tradition that has sort of given us this insight about the power of situational forces on human behaviour. So you saw him, I think when the psychiatrist came in and was trying to debrief the subjects, one of the things Milgram said at that point was, this tells us about the power of the situational influence. And that's, you know, I think one of the most dominant and important lessons that we draw from social psychology as a whole. And I would say Milgram's experiment is at the centerpiece of that demonstration. It's just such a powerful demonstration of how, you know, it's not so much about a person's personality so much as it is about the situation that they're confronting. So, I mean, scientifically, his legacy is enormous. It's kind of shocking to me to see that Harvard declined to give him tenure at the time. I mean, you sort of look at that now and think that probably wasn't the greatest decision on their part. But, I mean, that's the scientific part. I mean, in terms of his legacy for the ethical side, I mean, that's, I guess, a different question, because I do think experiments like the Milgram experiment were instrumental in getting ethical review boards to think a little more carefully about what we should be allowing.
To that end, what did you make then of the way the experiment was just put on stage here, how it was dramatized? It took up, what would we say, the first half hour of the movie, I'd say, is pretty much the experiment. Did you think it honored what that experiment probably looked like?
Yes, I do. I do think the depiction of the subject's behaviour and the experimental setup was very realistic. One of the things I really liked about it is the fact that it showed the subject squirming and being so uncomfortable in that situation. And that I think was the dominant response. I mean, people, I think, sometimes misinterpret this experiment as telling us about blind obedience and as if people are kind of automatically responding to these situational forces. But it wasn't blind obedience. And in some ways, I think the way to think about this is it shows that people are ineffective in being disobedient. Most people wanted to try to pull out of that situation, but they couldn't. And so I thought the film did a really nice job of depicting that and the kind of internal struggle that they were having. I think one thing that it didn't necessarily talk about, and maybe this is not necessarily the sort of thing that a film could speak to, is what are the factors in that situation that actually led to such obedient behaviour? Because there are a number of different components in that situation that I think are really important, and that if you'd done it somewhat differently, maybe you wouldn't have seen quite the same behaviour. Milgram himself performed some of those variations.
To that end, there's a point of reference for a lot of us. In fact, that takes me to you, David, and I want you to tell me a bit about some of the things you noticed. There are very strategic choices here about how to stage, how to frame, how to act, how to even project certain circumstances. Tell me some of the things that stood out to you.
So you used the word staged in introducing this, and I think that's it's not a word that I think one often hears. It's obviously a major component of any filming, but it's not a word that I think is often used in describing kind of traditional feature films where the style is, in a sense, that we shouldn't be paying attention to film as film. We should be looking at this as though we were observing reality. And this, I think, one of the really intriguing choices here is how, in some sense, I think the initial setup does look like that. You feel like you're watching, it's a real room, a real experiment, and but very quickly it starts to sort of fracture audience expectation and any kind of traditional sense of using film as a sort of observational idea for an audience. And I guess one of the things that particularly struck me this time, I've seen it now twice, and the first time I really sort of focused on the storyline, and this time I actually was kind of thinking about it in terms of how a film was made. And I think the way Milgram himself is introduced is so striking in this. We see him for the first time in a glass booth. There's always this kind of sense of him, to me, as a kind of removed, almost oracular presence in the movie. We don't see, we see him from the back in a glass room. We hear his voice before we actually can associate it with the person. I mean, if you know the actor, if you know what Peter Sarsgaard sounds like, you'll figure out that it's him speaking. But I think if you didn't know that, you hear this kind of disembodied voice while you see him not speaking. And then finally, these things sync up. But by the time they do, there's this, what's really, it's done very subtly here, but I think it's a major shift, which is, and something that you hardly ever see in film, which is that breaking of the fourth wall, where the character actually turns to us in direct address and, you know, to the degree that this can happen in film, makes eye contact with the audience. And I think one of the things that struck me, and I think this happens about 2/3 of the way through the movie, and in a scene in the classroom where Milgram is challenged by this female student, and there's the topics that come up have to do with deception and illusion, and one of the things as a theater person that I think of is, in some ways, what this film, the ways in which it's kind of analogous to me and to thinking about an audience. You know, what relationship an audience has to a work of art, and the ways in which an audience is, being a member of an audience, you can get up and leave, but people almost never do. I'm often in a theater where I see people who feel in some way annoyed about something, or that they've been taken advantage of, but they don't leave. They are part of it. And I think, in a way, the film plays around with this with its own audience by having its principal character, who's somebody who, in some ways, I think it's very elegantly done here. He remains very elliptical to me as a character, and I think some of that has to do with Sarsgaard's performance. He's an actor who kind of specializes, I think, in a certain level of destabilizing an audience. He's hard to read as a person. So in one sense, I think he seems very distant from us. On the other, he does something that you hardly ever see in film, which is to look right in my eyes as an audience member and talk to me.
The Ferris Bueller move, you know, turn to the camera. This day is going crazy, that kind of thing.
And make me feel, as an audience member, that I am somehow complicit in what he's doing. And I think that is, it puts us in this very challenging role of, you know, you sort of feel like, well, now he's my friend. No one else in the movie is looking at me. I'm watching them, and they feel it at arm's length, but he's, you know, he's in my camp, I'm in his.
I think that complicitness is really significant, since a lot of this festival has been about what is it like to sit in these seats and watch these disturbing stories, and how do we feel in some ways that we're voyeuristically or otherwise participating in something that might seem unethical. And note that his turning towards us is, on the one hand, an autobiographical move on the part of that character to share his life, but is it not reminiscent, especially since a lot of these have a very Aaron Sorkin, West Wing, walk and talk sort of feel, like he's our tour guide, basically. We're being led by him, and just as his experiments are about obedience, if he's moving and we're being led and following, we're obeying, essentially, as viewers and somehow watching the movie.